This is Animal Attacks, and I'm Christopher. Today, we're looking at a case where a man pushes his girlfriend into a grizzly bear enclosure, and in that moment, everything breaks in seconds. From a Texas paddock that turns violent fast to a river in Botswana that looks calm right up until it isn't. Let's begin with the first story, where a couple arrive at a wildlife viewing facility, and things go wrong inside the enclosure. It was August 14th, 2015, at a wildlife park near Rapid City, South Dakota. The facility operated as a public wildlife education and conservation center, featuring large outdoor habitats for North American species, including a grizzly bear enclosure separated from visitors by multiple safety barriers. Dessa Corval, 24, was originally from Montana and worked as a filing clerk at a regional administrative services company, living a routine life centered on work, home gardening, and a small group of long-term acquaintances. She traveled through western South Dakota with her partner, Thomas Briel, 27, during a planned road trip following a period of reported tension in their relationship, including financial disagreements and uncertainty about their future. Late that morning, they arrived at the wildlife park near Rapid City and entered the main viewing area together. Thomas was unemployed after losing a warehouse logistics job because of attendance issues, and there were past concerns about controlling behavior in the relationship, including a police report that was later withdrawn. People who knew them described the relationship as going through cycles of being close and then pulling apart, and on the morning of the visit, he had already been drinking before they arrived. During their time at the facility, he was mostly quiet, hanging a step behind Dessa as they walked through the area. He was just kind of there behind her the whole time, not really saying anything. The wildlife facility contained a large outdoor grizzly habitat enclosed by multiple barriers intended to prevent direct contact between animals and visitors. At the time of the incident, 2 grizzly bears were present in the enclosure and moving through a wooded section of the habitat. Visitor traffic was typical for the time of day, with small groups positioned along the viewing railings at varying distances. While near the primary viewing railing, Dessa paused to take a photograph. Thomas moved to stand beside her and placed a hand on her back. A brief exchange occurred that nearby visitors could not clearly hear. He then physically forced her over the outer railing and secondary barrier, falling approximately 3 to 8 feet from the visitor platform into the enclosure below. She landed on uneven ground and likely sustained fractures and possible cervical spine injury or head trauma from the impact. She may have remained briefly conscious, but was unable to stand or move to safety. One of the grizzly bears responded to the sudden intrusion and movement, approached within a short time following initial investigation. The animal investigated and then made physical contact, inflicting severe blunt force and puncture injuries consistent with a defensive aggressive encounter following sudden human intrusion into the enclosure. A second bear remained nearby, but did not directly engage. The way it escalated so quickly after the fall doesn't even feel real, but it is. The resulting injuries were rapidly life-threatening, with likely major internal bleeding and extensive internal injuries leading to hemorrhagic shock. Staff activated deterrent systems, including alarms and aversive measures, which contributed to the bears withdrawing after a brief period of continued staff monitoring. Staff and emergency responders entered only after multiple confirmations that both bears had retreated and the enclosure was secured under protocol. Dessa was found in critical condition with severe injuries from both the fall and the bear attack. She was rushed to a trauma center, but she died shortly after arriving due to heavy internal bleeding and major damage to multiple organ systems. A forensic review listed the cause of death as massive hemorrhage due to blunt force and penetrating injuries sustained in a bear attack, with contributory injuries from the fall. Rapid incapacitation was likely following initial bear contact, with injuries too severe to support a prolonged defensive struggle. Thomas Briel remained at the viewing area after the incident and was detained by facility staff until law enforcement arrived. He was arrested on scene, charged with first-degree murder, and later convicted. Following the incident, the facility temporarily closed the affected viewing area, conducted a safety review, and updated the barrier design in that section. They always say they're going to look at safety again, and they do, but it never really changes the fact that something already went wrong in the worst possible way. Public reporting remained limited and largely regional, with no public statements from the victim's family. The incident led to internal reviews of visitor supervision procedures near high-risk enclosures. From a controlled enclosure near Yellowstone, where danger is at least meant to be contained, we jump to a place with nothing holding anything back. Open farmland in rural Texas, where the only limits are fences that don't always hold. It was September 6th, 2016, in a rural paddock in Frio County, Texas, a few miles outside Pearsall. The incident occurred in the late afternoon in dry, open farmland with limited nearby activity and no immediate external witnesses beyond those on the property. Cleet Dervin, 48, was a longtime farmer working dry land cotton and sorghum on family property in Frio County. By 2016, he was under sustained financial strain, including equipment loan arrears and reduced irrigation access, following county-level infrastructure changes that affected water flow across his fields. He lived on the property with his 16-year-old son, Breck, and had a pattern of regular alcohol use in the evenings. A dispute with a neighboring property owner over alleged crop damage had escalated over several months. The neighbor operated a small horse boarding arrangement on adjacent land that included several animals used for light riding and training. Records and later statements indicated Cleet had entered the neighboring paddock without permission on multiple occasions and had physically struck one horse over a period of weeks prior to the incident. Cleet slipped through a loose gap in the boundary fence and went into the neighboring paddock, carrying a metal pipe. The horse was standing near a water trough in the far corner, turned slightly away from the fence, and just going about its usual routine. Breck was present on the fence line within direct view of the paddock and did not move from his position during the initial approach. The horse's behavior at that time was described as alert and stationary, with attention directed toward Cleet as he entered the enclosure. Being that close and just watching it happen has to stick with someone forever. Cleet approached the horse and made contact using the conduit, prompting the animal to move away from the corner and reorient toward him. As the distance closed, the horse reared and struck, followed by kicking behavior during continued agitation. The impact caused him to fall immediately to the ground. He didn't get back up or show any purposeful movement after the fall. Breck stayed at the fence line and watched what was happening, not going into the paddock during those first moments. The horse remained within the paddock after the first impact and delivered multiple discrete hoof strikes over a brief interval. The strikes were directed toward the upper body and torso area, while Cleet remained largely motionless. Following the initial impact and fall, additional strikes occurred during a brief period before the horse disengaged. Breck entered the paddock shortly after the movement stopped and reached his father, who was. He contacted emergency services and remained with him on site until responders arrived. Emergency personnel arrived after a short rural response interval, initiated assessment, and pronounced death at the scene due to catastrophic injuries incompatible with survival. A medical examiner determined the cause of death to be fatal traumatic brain injury due to blunt force impact, with associated cervical spinal fractures and thoracic trauma. Toxicology results indicated a blood alcohol level of 0.19 at the time of death. The report did not identify evidence of prolonged defensive struggle beyond the initial impact sequence and early post-impact phase. Veterinary evaluation of the horse conducted after the incident identified healed injuries consistent with prior repeated physical trauma. The animal was not euthanized and remained under the care of its owner following assessment. Local authorities reviewed the case and concluded that the death was consistent with an animal responding to sustained provocation, and no criminal charges were filed. Breck Dervin was placed in the care of a relative outside Frio County and did not return to the property. Local reporting on the incident was limited, consisting mainly of brief notices in regional outlets. The paddock fencing and boundary area were later repaired, and the neighboring horse boarding operation continued normal activity following the review process. There's a hard part in this kind of case that isn't the moment itself, but what comes after. For someone like Breck, it's not just what he saw, it's that it happened in a place that doesn't stop reminding you of it, even when everything looks normal again. A different kind of silence shows up next, this time along a river in Botswana. It was July 19th, 2015, at a tributary bend of the Okavango River system, about 40 kilometers northeast of Maun, Botswana. The area was a slow-moving offshoot of the river during dry season conditions, with sandbanks, papyrus edges, and shallow channels that appeared still from the surface. Fen Quarrel, 22, from Exeter, was on a gap year after leaving university on academic probation. He was traveling through southern Africa with a loosely organized group of 5 travelers he met at a hostel in Maun. Their guide had temporarily left for supplies and was expected back the next day, leaving the group unsupervised. The afternoon was spent at a river bend with limited activity, and alcohol was shared. The group later discussed crossing to a nearby sandbar based on visual estimates of distance and assumed safe conditions. I think this is where you already start to feel how unprepared the situation actually is. Priya Nandal began recording as the group moved toward the water's edge. Reuben Ash said the crossing looked short and manageable, and no formal check of depth, current, or wildlife presence was done. They had seen local herders cross similar stretches before, which shaped their judgment, but those crossings were done at known safe spots, and with experience of the water and seasonal conditions. The tributary bend was within the known range of a resident Nile crocodile, which wildlife officers later described as a mature territorial male over 4 meters in length. In dry season conditions, crocodiles in such habitats can remain nearly motionless near sandbanks or submerged structures with little surface indication. The water appeared calm and reflective, with limited visibility below the surface. Fen entered from the near bank in swim shorts and swam at a steady freestyle pace toward the opposite side, progressing several meters without interruption. The group remained on the bank watching as he reached and passed the midpoint, with no visible signs of immediate danger from the surface. Without warning, movement occurred near the far sandbar as the crocodile surged from a submerged position and closed distance within seconds. Contact occurred just beyond the midpoint, with a bite to his upper left torso and arm pulling him underwater immediately. Severe trauma occurred on impact, followed by rotational, death roll behavior, consistent with prey dismemberment mechanics. He briefly resurfaced during the attack sequence, but showed no coordinated movement before being submerged again. Priya Nandal kept filming for a few seconds after he went under, just holding on to a still shot of the water and the far bank, before she lowered her phone. The others reacted right away, and one person stepped toward the shallow water, but stopped pretty quickly when it got deeper, and they weren't sure what they were dealing with. Someone in the group then used a satellite device to call emergency services within a few minutes. People reacting differently like that says a lot about how fast it hits them. A response team was dispatched from Maun, and a helicopter arrived later that afternoon. Despite coordinated searches along the river channel and nearby sandbanks, Fen was not located during the initial operation. Recovery efforts continued over the following days, focusing on downstream areas and submerged vegetation, where slower current and reduced visibility made detection more difficult. His remains were recovered 2 days later downstream and identified through dental records. A post-incident examination concluded that death resulted from drowning, combined with catastrophic penetrating and crush injuries consistent with a large crocodilian bite, with associated drowning, including severe thoracic injury, likely major vascular disruption, and associated drowning. The report noted that incapacitation would have been rapid due to major traumatic injury and immediate submersion. Authorities issued a brief statement confirming the incident and advising against swimming in known crocodile habitats. Regional media in Botswana and the United Kingdom published short reports with limited personal detail. Family members declined interviews. Priya Nandal provided a brief account through an intermediary, but did not release her recording publicly, and other members of the group did not speak publicly about the incident. Reuben Ash returned to the United Kingdom and completed his studies without further comment. The crocodile involved was assessed as a resident territorial animal and was not relocated, remaining within its established range. We shift into southern Spain, where danger isn't hidden at all. It's part of the setup, just handled with less control than people assume. It was April 23, 2017, at a private ranch facility outside Ronda, Andalusia. The elephant had been temporarily housed at the facility by a traveling animal exhibition company, operating with limited oversight and minimal formal regulation. Pasco Del Varne, 41, worked as a sales manager for a commercial flooring company in Malaga, and lived a relatively ordinary life, with occasional social trips involving longtime friends. He attended a private gathering at the ranch with several acquaintances, where guests spent a long lunch drinking, before gathering near a fenced dirt enclosure for an informal demonstration involving a large adult Asian elephant temporarily housed by a traveling exhibition company. It's the mix that stands out: casual drinking, then suddenly something as heavy and unpredictable as an elephant in front of people who aren't really prepared for it. The enclosure had basic barriers and limited safety infrastructure, and the elephant was initially guided through simple commands by handlers, while guests were allowed unusually close interaction for photographs and demonstrations. As the activity continued, it became increasingly distracted and less responsive to the movement and crowding around it. Observers near the fence noted growing difficulty maintaining safe spacing, and staff called for greater caution as the situation became more difficult to control, though the demonstration continued despite earlier concerns. Pasco eventually entered the enclosure carrying food intended for the demonstration and repeatedly approached the elephant at close range, while others watched from behind the barriers. Witnesses later noted that the situation had already become loosely controlled, with multiple people moving in and out of safe distance zones while the animal was being used to interact with guests. The main mistake really came down to there just not being clear boundaries. Pasco kept going in, close to feed, and interact with the elephant. Even after it was pretty obvious, it wasn't really comfortable with all the crowding around its head and trunk. Every time he stepped back in, it just added more pressure to a situation that was already getting tense. The elephant started showing warning signs like head shaking, ear spreading, and repeated trunk movements. And in that tight space, with nowhere much to go, it all kind of escalated faster than anyone seemed to expect. Those warning signs don't really register at the moment unless someone is already paying close attention. The impact subjected him to massive blunt force trauma, multiple rib fractures, severe chest compression, lung injuries, and major internal bleeding would later be identified as the primary injuries. Pasco collapsed immediately after the elephant moved away and was clearly struggling to breathe while appearing pale and increasingly confused. Staff entered the enclosure within seconds and attempted to assist him while emergency services were contacted. He remained conscious briefly and reportedly said he was having trouble breathing before he became unresponsive a few minutes later. Emergency responders arrived after a delay due to the rural location, and resuscitation efforts on site were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead shortly after reaching medical care, with a review attributing the cause to catastrophic blunt force thoracic trauma, internal bleeding, and hemorrhagic shock from the crushing injuries. Authorities later cited multiple safety and regulatory violations at the facility, leading to penalties after the investigation. Video footage briefly circulated online before being removed, and local outlets in Andalusia reported the incident in short summaries over the following days, with limited wider coverage. His social media remained active for a short time before being taken down by his family, and the ranch later resumed limited operations under tighter restrictions on animal demonstrations and public interactions. There's something about these cases that always feels slightly unreal when you read them back. Not because they're hard to understand medically, but because they come from a chain of small, ordinary decisions that only make sense in the moment. And the next one is a chimpanzee sanctuary in West Africa, where everything looks controlled until a single broken rule or weak lock proves it isn't. It was February 11th, 2014, at a primate rehabilitation sanctuary about 60 kilometers from Conakry, Republic of Guinea. The enclosure was part of a controlled program for rescued chimpanzees in a semi-forested environment. Oscar Tenvik, 29, from Tromsø, Norway, had 6 weeks of volunteer experience at the sanctuary and was assigned to basic husbandry tasks. Staff described him as engaged and personally attached to the animals, despite being explicitly prohibited from unsupervised enclosure entry. He knew the rules here. Everyone did. Marit Ylvis, 27. From Tartu, Estonia, a graduate anthropology student described as cautious, agreed to accompany him when he proposed entering the enclosure, later stating she had expressed concern but did not inform staff. The enclosure housed 8 chimpanzees under the dominance of Koba, a 28-year-old male weighing approximately 150 pounds. He had been confiscated from the bushmeat trade as a juvenile and had lived at the sanctuary for 19 years. Adult male chimpanzees are not predators in the conventional sense, but their aggression is social and territorial and can involve severe, sustained physical force. Koba had 2 prior recorded incidents involving adult male visitors in 2009 and 2012. Oscar got into a restricted entry point using a key that wasn't properly controlled while staff weren't around, basically banking on the chimpanzees, staying on the east side, while he and Merritt stayed to the west. With the senior primatologist out doing a health check somewhere else, and the volunteer supervisor off-site, they went through the keeper corridor during a quiet part of the morning and shut the gate behind them. Koba had already finished feeding when Safi approached, and Oscar crouched to meet her while Marit stood just behind him. Within minutes, Koba emerged from the vegetation berm and stopped. When Marit turned toward the exit, she found it locked, with the key in Oscar's jacket and out of immediate reach. Koba closed the distance in seconds, vocalizing loudly and drawing the attention of 2 subordinate males from the far end of the enclosure. That kind of speed doesn't leave much room for anyone to react. He took Oscar down at shoulder height. His first bites targeted the face, causing severe lacerations, including partial loss of the nose and a deep wound to the left cheek. He restrained Oscar's wrists while Marit called out toward the locked gate. Koba then inflicted severe injuries to the groin region consistent with high-intensity territorial aggression, followed by traumatic injuries to the hands, including the loss of 2 fingers on the left hand and the right thumb at the metacarpal joint. Oscar's vocalizations diminished shortly afterward, and he became minimally responsive. A kitchen worker heard the commotion and reached the exterior corridor within a short time, but could not access the inner gate. He alerted senior staff, who arrived minutes later, activated an aversive alarm, and caused the chimpanzees to withdraw deeper into the enclosure. Senior staff then used a master key after confirming partial animal displacement. Oscar was still conscious, but in really bad shape, with heavy blood loss and signs of shock getting worse quickly. He tried to say something in Norwegian for a moment before he passed out. Emergency services were called immediately, but the nearest medical facility was several miles away, and transport arrived later that morning. He died before reaching advanced care, approximately 12 minutes after entry into the enclosure, from hemorrhagic shock due to major femoral and inguinal vascular injury, with additional severe facial and soft tissue trauma. Injuries included partial nasal amputation, deep facial lacerations, multiple finger amputations, and extensive vascular and soft tissue damage consistent with a chimpanzee attack, with limited defensive injuries to the forearms and hands consistent with brief attempted resistance. The sanctuary suspended its volunteer program following internal review. Investigators identified failures in key control procedures, supervision during staff absence, and enforcement of enclosure access restrictions. The incident was reported briefly in international media without detailed injury descriptions. Marit Ilves returned to Estonia and completed her studies. In 2016, she testified on volunteer safety standards, describing the lack of immediate exit options once inside the enclosure. Koba remained at the sanctuary under continued observation and care. We end up at a roadside pullout in the Rockies. No enclosure, no buffer, just a thin distance line that people routinely misjudge. It was July 26th, 2015, at a riverside viewing pullout in Lower Zambezi National Park, Zambia. The location sat along a wide bend in the river, where floodplains open into shallow channels, and hippos regularly surface close to the bank during the late afternoon. Davith Pruell, 33, from Waukesha, Wisconsin, was traveling with his wife Neva, 31, and their daughter Yola. Neva had recently completed a short photography course and spent much of the trip documenting river scenery and wildlife. Earlier that day, she observed other visitors standing relatively close to the waterline while hippos remained partially submerged nearby, interpreting it as normal viewing behavior. The family had no prior experience with large African wildlife. The pullout overlooked a slow-moving section of river lined with reeds and sandbanks, where hippos commonly rest in submerged groups during the day. On that afternoon, a large bull was partially visible just offshore near the bank. No ranger was stationed at the site. Neva exited the vehicle, holding Yola, while Davith remained inside briefly. She moved toward the viewing edge where other visitors were standing, then lifted Yola slightly for a clearer view of the water. Davith noticed, called out, and quickly moved after her along the open bank. Small gaps between people can matter a lot near water like this. As Davith advanced, the water nearby began to churn. The hippo rose higher in the waterline, breaking the surface and holding position close to the bank. It snorted repeatedly and maintained a tense, blocking posture in the shallows, creating short bursts of turbulence as it remained fixed on the shoreline disturbance. The reaction was instant. As the hippo surged in the shallow water, the ground and water around them shifted hard. Yola was knocked from Neva's arms by the force and thrown sideways onto the sand, away from the edge. She didn't move right away. Neva moved toward Yola while remaining near the edge of the viewing area, still exposed to the shoreline. At the same time, Davith continued forward along the open bank instead of retreating, attempting to close distance between the group and the approaching animal. The hippo then committed forward from the shallows in a rapid charge, accelerating along the shoreline. The distance closed in seconds. Davith was struck at close range by the animal's forward mass and body bulk, collapsing his stance and forcing him violently onto the sand in a crushing impact, consistent with severe blunt trauma and minimal chance of recovery. The animal then broke off its forward movement and returned toward the waterline. It happens fast. There's almost no time to react once it commits. Davith remained conscious briefly, oriented toward his daughter, reportedly calling Neva's name once before his condition deteriorated. Bystanders moved in quickly, with one visitor attempting direct pressure on visible injuries, while others called for help. Park rangers arrived later and took control of the area. They gave basic first aid where they could and called for more help. Because the place was remote, medical help took time to get there. When the medical team finally arrived, they checked Davith and confirmed he had died at the scene. The coroner attributed the death to a hippo charge, noting severe abdominal and pelvic crushing injuries with likely major vascular disruption and internal organ rupture, not survivable without immediate advanced surgical care. Wildlife officials reiterated warnings about maintaining distance from riverbanks and noted that hippos can charge on land with little warning when they perceive nearby movement. The incident received limited regional coverage. Neva did not issue a public statement. Yola was transported for medical evaluation due to injuries sustained in the fall, including suspected shock and possible concussion after being displaced outside the direct impact zone. Davith Pruill's family requested privacy. The hippo was not tracked or removed, consistent with standard wildlife policy for territorial behavior. What remained was a brief sequence of ordinary decisions along the riverbank, stepping closer, holding position, misreading calm water, that aligned in seconds into a fatal outcome.